Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and as some of you might know who saw my online poll, I have been looking for someone to invite to this channel that I can thoroughly disagree with, because so far all of my guests here were people whose analysis I largely support, and I do think there is value and virtue in talking to people we don't always agree with. So I haven't yet managed to actually find a proper neocon who would want to debate, but a friend of the show, David Pyne, kindly introduced me to one of his colleagues who we know holds different views about the war in Ukraine, NATO, and probably also about China. Robert Bob McEntee is the Utah State Director of the Task Force of National and Homeland Security. He has extensive United States Air Force planning and training experience, being himself a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. After finishing a degree in history and German, he worked as a navigator and pilot toward the end of the Cold War and in the 1990s and 2000s. I must stress that Bob does not view himself as part of the Neocon crowd, but as a conservative Republican with military background. So, Bob, thank you very much for joining me today.
That's a great intro. Thank you, Pascal.
Thanks for that. So just again about this talk, the point of this exercise is a bit that we try to understand how some of the things that we are seeing in international relations make sense to each other and why we don't come to the same conclusions. So maybe to start with, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you would describe your views in relations to Ukraine, and how prevalent you think your own views are within, like, let's say, US society, or like in Utah, of your immediate environment?
Yeah, actually tomorrow night, 24, well, a little less than maybe 22 hours from now, we're going to have a debate of the GOP, candidates for president, right? So we'll have Vivek Ramaswamy will be on there. I'm sure you follow this, you know this. Donald Trump won't be on there. But I noticed last time when Vivek mentioned that he didn't think we should support the war in Ukraine, he got jumped on by these other candidates. I was actually a little bit surprised, but Nikki Haley definitely jumped on him, Mike Pence, and I noticed what all the people that opposed Vivek's stance was that they said, this is the front line, right? They see it as not just a proxy war, and I don't really want to say it's a proxy war. I look at it like almost like a nation's been victimized, right? That Ukraine, they weren't preparing for war with Russia. They might have been considering things Russia didn't like, but I mean, Russia rolled tanks on Ukraine, not the other way around, right? So Americans, I think we kind of appreciate the underdog, right? Because in our Revolutionary War, and we all learn about this in school, we were the big underdog, right? I mean, France took a chance on us. France loaned us money, but Great Britain at the time, England was the superpower. And a lot of people just didn't think we had a chance. A lot of Americans, about a third, were loyal to the King of England, right? A third wanted there to be a revolution, and a third kind of wanted neutrality. They didn't really want to have to choose either way. And it was only some of that third that wanted independence that actually fought, right? So, but we come from that background, so we understand what it's like to be the underdog. Even though we might be a superpower now, we still have sympathy. And one thing, people think, where do we get this in our heads? Why should the U.S. always be helping everybody out? Because we can't fight every war, right? We really can't go into every place in Africa or where there's injustice. But Europe, we have a special bond with. There's 31 nations in NATO, including the U.S. and Canada, and no one's ever left NATO. No country that has joined it has ever left it. Now, we see that some of the states that were part of the USSR, when they had a chance to be independent, they preferred that. And I looked up what John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural address, because I think the world kind of still remembers what Kennedy said, at least in some way. I'll just quote him. It's a short quote. He said, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty." And he didn't say ally, right? Because a lot of people say that. I hear people that like, hey, you know what? Ukraine's not our ally. What do we care what happens to Ukraine? Well, that's one way to look at it. But he said support any friend. So if Ukraine, even if there is, I'll grant there might be some corruption in Ukraine, right? I don't know the details, but I hear a lot about that. So I'm sure there's some, and there's some in the United States too, right? So we're not corruption free over here either. But we can see that they're being denied their liberty, right? At least the part that Russia wants to take over. And so we would say let's live up to what John F. Kennedy inspired us to say. Let's help the person who's having their liberty trampled on. I mean, I see it a lot like if you see a woman on the street getting raped, you don't go, well, is she my relative or my sister? Well, then I don't have to help her if she's not my relative. I mean, I would hope most people's instinct would be that's not right. Let's help this person being violated, right?
Yeah. So I have two questions here. One is, a lot of this framing hinges upon how you view what this war is, right? And at the beginning, you alluded to the fact that you could look at it as a proxy war in a certain sense. And I certainly view this as a proxy war, because it seems to me that most, if not all, of the rationale from the Russian part for invading, and you're right, I mean, the Russians rolled the tanks into Ukraine. That's why it looks so bad. Most of the rationale for that is because Russia says this NATO expansion has to stop. We are being threatened, and we are putting a foot down, and we're saying, like, no, we're not doing this. We are rather going to war with a nation that they are connected to the way that the United States is connected to Canada, right? A war between Russia and Ukraine is on a human level as tragic as one would be between the US and Canada. That's one thing. And the other one is this idea of the United States supporting liberty. It seems to do that only when it is geopolitically expedient. I mean, there's no talk about the United States standing for liberty in Saudi Arabia, right? Which literally chops off about 60 people's heads literally every year. And there is allies, US allies, that have completely different values from what the leadership in Washington usually proclaims. How do you make sense of these contradictions?
You know what I liked about the Air Force? I got to go around the world. I got to live in Saudi Arabia for a little while, right? We were the guests, right? And I'll tell you what, Saudi Arabia is very safe, right? You can walk the streets at night without much fear because, like you said, they punish crime severely. Usually they punish foreigners the most, right? They're not so into punishing their citizens. They let their own citizens get away with a lot. There is injustice, but Saudis have a certain amount of freedom. You know, if they wanted to come here to the United States and raise their hand and say, hey, I seek asylum, my country's terrible, we would probably let some of them in. We let many Iranians come here when they didn't like living under the Shah or the regime after the Shah. They would come to America and we would let them live here. And I think they're great citizens, right? So the framework, it does matter how you view it. But, you know, we're a little more touchy about Europe, right? Because America's ideological roots are from Europe, right? I mean, most of the people that came here are, you know, English, Irish, German, you know, a good mix of Europeans, some Italian, right? Probably not many Swiss, but maybe a few. And well, Switzerland's a great example because they have neutrality, but they also issue their men guns, right? It's not a pacifist sit on the couch neutrality with sandals. You'd be afraid to invade Switzerland. In fact, I like how General Yamamoto said that about, or Admiral Yamamoto, excuse me, said about the United States in World War II. He says, you could never invade the mainland US. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass, right? That's true. Americans love their guns. And I think it was a little bit of the fault of certain NATO countries in Ukraine, maybe that they didn't have the best defenses. And let me go somewhere else for a second. I've got fire extinguishers in my house, right? Because prevention's a good thing, right? I want to stop a fire when it's small. And we didn't do that with Ukraine. And I kind of fault, I think President Biden could have done a much better job. It seemed like when Russia said we're not going to invade, maybe he believed them or maybe he wanted this. I don't know what to tell you. I think Donald Trump would have worked harder to stop the war from happening, which would be ideal, right? I mean, if you can stop a war, it's better than having a proxy war. And I don't know if we first view it as a proxy war, we're going to send some aid. And I will tell you, I'm glad we're not sending US soldiers, that we're just sending some aid and that the Ukrainians are willing to fight. And it just like the Vietnamese beat the United States because they got aid from China and Russia and they had the will to fight. They didn't want to give up their land, right? So they just kept fighting the US. I mean, some of the Vietnamese, they wanted us to win that war and take over their country, and it might be like a Germany or Japan situation. But the communists, they wanted to fight, and I from what I'm hearing, the reports I hear, Ukrainians definitely have the will to fight, and that's what war is really about. It's a test of wills, right? Even though Russia might have superior forces, greater numbers of men, if you want to try to invade and occupy a country, your soldiers are going to be at risk, right? There's going to be dead Russians who are on patrol. Like, as long as they stay there, Ukrainians will kill Russians, right? And at some point, the Russians may decide it's not worth it. And I wish they believed more in neutrality, right? Because I think there's this Russian paranoia, and that's been a problem for a long time. Any Russian border, they've had a war, right? War with Finland, war with Japan, war with Mongolia, war with Ukraine, war with Poland. I mean, you just name it. The Russians they've marched on Berlin a couple of times, right? So they seem to have this paranoia of NATO, but they really don't seem to get us that NATO, we're not looking to take over their frozen tundra, right? We don't want Russia, I don't know anyone that ever has, and anyone that's ever tried to like occupy Russia, good luck.
Yeah,
So,
but okay, if I may add my
yeah,
or sorry, okay, I just add one point, which is that any Russian just my age and older, like let's say like 35 and above, will remember that they were born in a country with a passport that doesn't exist anymore, right? They will remember, they will know that they were Soviet citizens, including the Ukrainians, Belarusians, and so on, all the way to Kazakhstan. They were Soviet citizens, and the Russians too, and that country broke apart. And then you read these texts from neocons in the United States and from think tanks that say, oh, we have to break up Russia, right? Russia should become 15 or 20 successor states in order for it to never make sense again. And then these people also remember that the last time their country broke up, the 1990s, was a horrible decade for Russia, right? Absolutely horrible because of the economic devastation and the sellout of the state, and like the average age sank to like 57 or 58 years, and millions of Russians died of alcoholism and so on. I mean, you remember that happened to you, and then you go like, okay, and we have here people who officially say this is what should happen to us again. Now the issue with Ukraine, then I would say like, where do you think the war started, in 2022 or in 2014 or in 2008?
well, I mean, it's Europe, and I'm an American history major, and I picked American history because it's only so long, right? European history, just there's so much of it, and that's the problem with trying to answer that. Well, yes, 2008, I think that's when they took back the Crimea, right?
2014, that was, yeah.
Oh, 2014, right? Okay, so they took back parts of Georgia. They put down rebellion in Chechnya. Then they took back the Crimea in 2014 under Obama. That's right, because these both happened, one under Obama, one under Biden. They're both Democrat presidents who aren't big on the military. I mean, I think we should note that, right? That America, I think this might not have happened. Well, like Iran returned the hostages. Once Ronald Reagan got inaugurated, they could not return the hostages fast enough, right? So if we have a strong president, I think it prevents wars. But back to Russia. So Russia and the United States, Russia was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? The USSR. And they tried to pretend a little bit like they were the United States, I think, in a way, that they had all these satellite countries that wanted to join them. And hey, look, we've got a constitution, But the fact is, they're only similar on the surface. In the United States, every state we have petitioned to become a state. They had to ask, right? And then they had to get voted on by our Congress. And one by one, we added all the states from the original 13. So Hawaii, you could maybe dispute how voluntary that was. But the fact is they still had to petition. They still had to get voted in. Well, people say that some Native Hawaiians have an issue with that. I don't think many, right? And I don't see them clamoring to leave. But with Russia, how did they become states? Did Ukraine petition to become a Soviet state? No. They got taken over. Same with most of Eastern Europe. Even if they weren't technically part of the USSR, Poland, all these were, because they wanted that buffer zone, they wanted to control Eastern Europe. They weren't happy under Soviet domination, right? I mean, you're part of the United States, but you were under Soviet domination. And people want liberty. They want freedom. And it's unfortunate that Russia and Americans aren't better allies, because I think we could be. and we have a lot of similar backgrounds. There's kind of a Christian base in both, although you might miss that sometimes, but there is. And it's regrettable that things didn't go different, but they have, but Russia hasn't learned that it goes better if you're attractive and these states want to join you, and they do have some freedom, some autonomy.
But then what do you make out of the Donbass? But like since 2014, so in 2014 we've had this pivotal moment when in February of that year, the Ukraine was about to sign a association agreement with the European Union, but then the president, the democratically elected president at the time, Mr. Yanukovych, decided to sign an association agreement with Russia. Now, the Russian association agreement said you can sign an agreement with us and with anyone else you want. The European one said you can only sign with us. If you sign with us, we don't accept the Russian one. So Yanukovych goes for the Russian one. Then there's large protests in the streets, large protests, and people die. He is ousted from power, as in he's the regularly elected, democratically elected president, but he's ousted out of power 1 year before his due time. And then a thoroughly anti-Russian, pro-European parliament executive comes to power, which we know that Victoria Nuland, that's when she made her famous comment, F the European Union. I mean, we think these people should be running the Ukraine. And actually those people then came to power. And then in the Donbass, these two republics, they say like, screw this, we don't want to be part of this. So they start their rebellion against the central government, and their like warfare starts happening. And these two parts in the Donbass, they're also Ukraine, right? But they're not the Ukraine that agrees with central Kiev, Ukraine. What do you make out of this part?
Well, I look at it like my country, the United States, is rather diverse too, right? The government in California is not like the government in Utah, even though there's a lot of similarities. And we had a civil war, a bloody civil war. That was where we lost the most lives, was in our civil war. And so, yes, there's going to be controversy. I still think the reason you see that people more wanted the European affiliation, and it's nice that the Russians said you could have either, but people want liberty. That's what I see. And that's why I don't see this war going away, because another one of our founding fathers, Patrick Henry, said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And that's, we remember that quote especially well because it's still on the license plates from New Hampshire. He was from New Hampshire. They, live free or die. It's kind of how they paraphrase it now. But give me liberty or give me death. And I kind of think myself, that's how I look at it. Because yes, we could go, we don't want to provoke World War III with Russia. It's true. We'd rather this just stay contained like it is. And maybe there's a peace negotiation, or maybe the Ukrainians, we give them enough stuff to help push the Russians out, or the Russians just decide, okay, we shouldn't do this, right? But people want that liberty, and I think Europe offers that. And Russia, look what they did when they invaded. They made long neutral Sweden and long neutral Finland jump in with NATO because they scared them. They don't understand. They're being like the abusive boyfriend, right? They're scaring the woman right into the police, and that's why you can see now Ukraine would want to join NATO as soon as possible, because they would want that shield. Of course, NATO needs to spend a little more on their defense, in my opinion. But I think our American founding fathers are a great reflection, because he didn't say, he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Patrick Henry, he said that in 1775. And that's still how people view it, right? It's not, well, unless it's a big country that might crush us, right? Because England was much more powerful than America. And Russia is a powerful adversary. They have a huge nuclear force, but we can't just cower in fear. We need to, the bear needs to go home with a bloody paw. That's how I see it. That's, we have I'll let you in 1 second, but we've got a shoplifting epidemic in certain parts of the United States right now, where the Democrats are, and they're the more liberal, part of our country, the Democrat Party versus Republicans. Republicans are more law and order. Target's closing 9 stores, all in Democrat-run cities and states. They just announced it today. And why is it? Because shoplifting is rampant. Because they're not arresting shoplifters like in California, Washington, Oregon. They're letting these crimes go on. And I see it the same way. Is, the way to deter aggression is not to make peace with it. It's to send it home punished. And I honestly think the Russian bear needs to have its paw bloodied and it needs to go home.
Okay, I see the logic, but then my counter question again: what about what with the liberties of the people in the Donbas, you know, in Lugansk and Donetsk, who say we want liberty from Ukraine? And
Well,
second one, what when other states do that? Because you know, to me, it's just so striking that this line of argument is so prevalent at the moment, but that 20 years ago the United States invaded on the completely manufactured pretext Iraq, and Iraq was bloodied and drained, and you know the leader was hanged, and 1 million people are dead, and it's an absolute horrendous crime. But it's kind of, oh yeah, you oopsie daisy, that happened. But when Russia does something that can be compared, then well, the whole world has to stand up and stand for liberty. What about liberty in Iraq?
well, okay. Here's the tricky part: is you have to make judgments with what you know in time, right?
Hmm.
Because we heard a lot about weapons of mass destruction, right? And before the Gulf War, and Saddam did have some weapons of mass destruction things. He had a nuclear plant going that the Israelis took out, right? Because they saw it as a threat. So we know he had some program that might have been overblown. They might have sold the war to the American people.
I mean, we
right?
know there was nothing. Now we know that it was up. We know that
But
at the time the CIA and so on warned the
you
Bush
know what's similar?
administration. You know, we don't
I'll,
have anything.
okay, but we had security agreements with Saudi Arabia, and you know what? Saddam did roll tanks on Kuwait, right? So maybe your neutrality is a good idea. I think if Russia would apply by your neutrality, it'd be better. Same with Saddam Hussein. If he hadn't gone into Kuwait and threatened to go into Saudi Arabia, I think he would have been left alone. We left him alone before that. In fact, I think he was even a CIA asset at one point. But to your point, I would say for those two sections of the Donbass and what's the other one? I'm not so keen on these. The names are foreign to me. But the two regions,
Lugansk and Donetsk.
it would be proper, and I think the United States would have the standing to say this if we've given them all this aid. Let's say they win, or to say, hey, look, you know what? You should allow elections, you know, and there should be maybe some United States observers, right, of these, and other European observers of these elections, because if you're going to want to be a democracy and you're going to want liberty, then you should allow it for these sections too. I know that's kind of hard because countries don't want to be broken apart, right? The U.S. Civil War is because we didn't want to just let the South secede. Maybe we should have, right? But and I think our founders would have allowed states to secede, but we didn't, and so we had a war. So I think maybe we could take the lesson. It would be reasonable to say, look, if Ukraine wants to fight for liberty, great, we're all for it. But if these two, I'll call them states, want to secede basically and become part of Russia, you should let them have a vote, right? And then maybe realize that maybe in 10 or 20 years they'll want to come back to you, because they'll see that, you know, maybe we don't like living under Russian rule and we would rather come back with basically Europe. And I think Ukraine has quite a bit of European heritage. So I can see why they'd want to be in that orbit, you know, the European orbit more than the Russian. But I would agree. I think maybe there's room for, we could say you should, you know, do what you preach and allow these two states to have a vote. I would agree.
Thanks for that. I was wondering about the other one, or it took me a long time to kind of process why neutrality didn't emerge as a natural solution to Ukraine. You know, in my view, and I know this is the view of a lot of people in the US, from Noam Chomsky all the way to Henry Kissinger, who used to say, since 2014, Ukraine has to be neutral. You know, it's just the way that Austria was neutral during the Cold War and wasn't violated, Ukraine should be neutral now, and it should just be off the table. And we know that the last diplomatic effort that the Russians made before the full-scale invasion in 2022 was in December 21, when they sent these two draft treaties to Washington and to Brussels, I mean to the NATO headquarters, to say like, hey, let's make a security agreement for Europe, and Ukraine is off the table. It doesn't become part of NATO. It doesn't become part of a security alliance, which is basically the same as saying Ukraine has to be neutral. And that one was like just full out rejected by the US and NATO, said like, no, the door is open, the Ukrainians can join anytime. And in fact, the Ukrainians will join because it's part of the Ukrainian constitution since 2014 that they want to join. And we are not closing the door on them. Whereas when closing the door could have prevented the entire war because it would have made it neutral. So why do you think that this neutrality was not acceptable? And isn't this the reason for the war?
Well, I look at it this way, that I mean, think of Ukraine like a person. Shouldn't they be free to choose kind of who they want to, like, let's say, get married to, right? Whether it's the European Union or NATO or Russia. I see it's only because of Russian paranoia, and then NATO and the US's fear of what Russia might do, that Ukraine has to be made neutral. Why can't it just be free to associate with who they want to associate with? In fact, that's one of our constitutional freedoms, is freedom of association in the United States. So we're allowed to go to the church we want to go with, hang out with the people we want to hang out with, make political parties. That's all part of freedom of association. And I think Ukraine deserves that. They shouldn't just have to, well, because Russia's afraid of what might happen, you have to just be neutral, right?
Now, if Cuba decided to make a state treaty with China and allow 10,000 Chinese troops and a huge military bases right next to Guantanamo Bay, just right opposite to it, would that be fine? Would you be okay with that? It's like same principle.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be, but we allowed Russia to fly nuclear bombers into Venezuela. I don't think that was great. I think the Monroe Doctrine, which is what we call it, President Monroe said, look, basically, this is our whole, continent, right? The United States and including South America, North South America. That's our territory. Don't encroach on it. And that's why we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And I think that kept the peace. And
but why can the US have the Monroe Doctrine and the Russians cannot have even a near abroad, even a neighboring country?
Well, it's because of the European countries. And I think maybe we need more Russian exchange programs, right? I mean, of course, they would just spy on us. But the fact is, because they have such paranoia, it's like the West has no desire to conquer Russia. We might want a container, we might want favorable trade deals, but we're not looking to take over Russia. And I think they fear that because they've had, like I said, they've had wars on all their borders, and they've had wars with Ukraine before. And the Ukrainians remember that they were not treated well under the USSR. When they tried to implement the collective farming, and many Ukrainians starved to death, right, because of that policy. You're not going to forget that. I talked to my grandma. She was born in 1898. So these things pass on. And so what I'm saying is, Ukrainians that underwent this in the 20s or 30s, whenever it was, because they had a war with Russia in the 20s as well, when they were new Soviet. Then they had these policies in the 30s. They're going to remember. That's still in their conscience, right? They remember this, and they don't like how they were treated, so they don't want to be forced into a neutrality they don't want.
I understand that, and don't get me wrong, I understand why the Ukrainians fight. I guess if I was a Ukrainian, I would probably fight as well, because if you're attacked, you fight. I understand why they fight, and what you're saying with the Holodomor, with this horrible 2-3 million people who starved to death in the 1930s, that's absolutely horrendous. And of course, that remains part of the collective conscience, the way that the Holocaust is part of the collective conscience of all Jews. I absolutely agree. What I don't understand is, like, if we take again the metaphor of the street, if you see a little guy and a big guy that fight with each other, and the little guy and both get bloody noses, isn't the first reaction to try to take them apart and say, stop, guys? Whereas what we are doing at the moment, what it seems to me, we are pushing the little guy, we're giving the little guy even more baseball bats, etc., and then the other one gets the bigger baseball bat, and the little one gets beaten up even more. So what makes my heart bleed is that I see so many Ukrainians die and Russians die for something that shouldn't have taken place in the first place. So the natural reaction would be to say, like, stop, guys, immediately. This is the most important thing, is that you guys stop, because, like, even the little guy is getting beaten up really, really horribly right now.
I get that, but I think that goes back to the give me liberty or give me death, right? Because the alternative to, you're going to want to fight if someone threatens your liberty. And we've got the history of, it was only so long ago when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979, right? And they only lost, I mean, they they didn't lose nearly as many men. I'm trying to remember if I looked it up. It was 10,000 or 25,000. I don't think they lost more than 25,000 men in Afghanistan, but they decided that that was enough, that they had lost too many people. I guess they thought it wasn't worth it. So I would kind of hope that history repeats itself. And there is some history in Russia. If the leader, whoever it is, whether it's Soviet
Yeah,
or just Russia, if they're losing a war, it's not good for their PR, right?
yeah, but
And I noticed, yeah,
the
go ahead.
problem is if history does repeat itself, it would mean that in 15 years, the United States will invade Ukraine, right? Because that's what happened with Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is sad for 40 years, a very sad place. So if history repeats, then in 15 years, we have
Well,
US boots on the ground in order to invade Ukraine.
but the reason we did invade Afghanistan, and we were like the only people that have ever successfully done that, to tell you the truth, was allegedly because, you know, the Taliban had orchestrated with Osama bin Laden to attack the United States directly on our homeland, on the two buildings in New York, you know, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So we didn't want that to happen again. I mean, that's at least the story. I don't know all the full details for real, but we felt that was a very just war, and I think it's unfortunate how we pulled out of there. We may have tempted Russia to do an expedition because of what a bad pullout we did from Afghanistan, right? Because I think they feared us. I mean, we were right on China's back door and right next to Russia.
Your audio is gone. For some reason, your audio is gone.
I'm sorry, am I back now?
But yeah, you're back. You're back.
Okay. So when we did invade Afghanistan and subdue it, try to give it some measure of democracy, which I agree. See, a neocon might think we can transplant democracy into Afghanistan. I know it's not going to work, right? Because their whole culture does not lean toward democracy. It leans toward give us a leader. Most of the Arab nations are that way. They still have kings, right? The Saudi Arabian, it's a royal family. Same with Jordan. They have a different mindset. We're not going to be able to transplant our ideals into most Arab countries that easily. Like, look at Iran. They're a religious, you know, autocracy. So they're very different. But we did keep the order there. And I think it was a botched pullout that made us look weak. And I think it might have tempted the Russians to go, you know, maybe now's the time to get some territory back. But I really think Russia should have kept their neutrality and let Ukraine decide. And I think maybe they were right to push for elections in those. But I'll tell you what, being Irish, I'm half Irish, right? And I still remember our heritage from there. You know, the English moved a bunch of people into Northern Ireland and said, okay, let's have an election now. Right. Now that they got enough Englishmen in Northern Ireland, they say, let's have an election. Oh, look, a sixth of your country voted to leave. And now so those things can be orchestrated, right? If Russians tried to move a lot of people into an area and say, okay, now let's have an election. Well, is that really valid? And so unless things are done right, they're not going to be done ever, right? It has to be done the right way. So we need honest elections there. If those two states really, there might be some people that really do want to separate, or it's just, hey, you know what? If you want to leave and go live in Russia, go ahead. That might be the other alternative. I don't think we have to try to transplant American style government in Ukraine. I just think we do want to be an ally to help them, that they would have their liberty to choose how they want to live. And if they want to be neutral, like Switzerland or Austria, maybe that would serve them well. And actually, maybe it would. But they should still have the freedom to say, you know, we want to be in the Soviet or the Russian sphere, or we want to be in the US sphere or the NATO sphere or EU, whatever they decide.
Yeah, but don't you think that this would automatically solicit further intervention from the US? I mean, again, you just alluded to the view that actually you agree with the Monroe Doctrine. You know, the Southern Hemisphere, like the West is the backyard of the United States, right? So Cuba shouldn't have the freedom to have a security agreement with Russia or with China, because obviously that would be a threat to the United States, right? Because I hear this a lot, because you talked about that Russia actually is like paranoid about its security, but I hear a lot about the United States, you know, viewing Chinese island building on the other end of the Pacific as a great threat to the United States. And I hear this repeating, right, that there's one single military base that Russia has, that China has in Africa, in Djibouti, and that's a military threat, that to the United States. How come that you view this this hemisphere as important as the backyard of the US, but other great powers and other countries, they shouldn't be paranoid, even if they have a history of being broken up just 35 years ago?
Okay, the United States, we've probably gone too far the other way because we have not kept the Monroe Doctrine, right? We don't control the Panama Canal that we built anymore. And that is a very strategic waterway. Jimmy Carter, he's an internationalist, right?
Which belongs to Panama, the nation of Panama, yes.
Yes, but China runs it, right? So we gave up a great strategic asset that we lost lives building, right? And I don't think anyone would have taken it from us, but we gave it up. And that was a big power shift, right? We don't control the Panama Canal anymore. I was down there at Howard Air Force Base in Panama, right? When the US controlled it all. So we have let other countries have inroads. I guess we've erred on the side of peacefulness there, and yet that could eventually be used against us. I just think that Ukraine is really more part of Europe, and there needs to be a line there that Russia don't come into NATO countries, right? And they know that. But Ukraine wants that European umbrella, or most of Ukraine does, and they should be able to say, we want that. And so Russian paranoia needs to realize, well, we may not be okay with you empire building and taking on new countries, and Moldova next, and then maybe Poland, but we're okay with you having domain over Russia, right?
But so, okay, let's leave that aside. I mean, actually, the Panama Canal is really interesting because there is a valid state treaty between the United States and Panama that actually, funnily enough, really literally neutralizes the Panama Canal. That's the word they use. The Panama Canal is a neutral waterway in peace and under war. I don't know further what that would mean, but this is an interesting thing. Maybe we can. I will look at this in another time. But Ukraine, and if we now look at, okay, if the world was perfect, then none of this would ever have happened, and we would have a happy and prosperous Ukraine and happy and prosperous Russia, right? We can agree on that. That would be in everybody's interest.
Sure.
Now we have this problem that what's next? I mean, Russia incorporated Crimea into its state territory back in 2014, and it incorporated these four regions, oblasts, into its state territory this time. Now, if what you're saying comes true, and like Ukraine gets to enter NATO, and Ukraine doesn't give up any of these territories, it would mean that by the second it signs the NATO treaty, NATO would import a territorial conflict, a hard conflict, where we have two states that have overlapping claims, would be imported into NATO, and that this would automatically, I mean, Ukraine could trigger Article 5, saying, look, these Russian troops are on our lands, now you have to help us. Is that something that you think is worth it or not?
Well, no, that's too far. And I think that's why we've told Ukraine, you're not going to be eligible to join NATO until this war's over, right? Whether it's a peace treaty that resolves it, or you kick the Russians out, whichever way. But also NATO, I think it requires agreement from all the 31 countries, right? And we saw that Turkey has not okayed Sweden, or was it Finland? One of the two to join. Sweden, thank you. So I'm sure there'd be someone to protest, probably Turkey. Turkey's pretty friendly with Russia as well, right? We have to recognize that. They're not completely in the U.S. sphere. We have a base there, but they're very friendly with the Russians as well. So I'm sure Turkey would protest on Russia's behalf and not allow that to happen. And we don't want to trigger a war by signing a treaty like that. And I kind of wish, I liked what that Russian general, well, not really Russian general, but, the contract general, Petrovich or something. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with his name, but the general that basically, yes, he was going to march on Moscow, right? He was fed up with how they were running the war down there. And I would wish there was a little bit more of that in Russia. Now, they're very severe in how they react to those things. But here in the U.S., protests against Vietnam had an effect on the government, right? It made the government not have the will to keep on the draft and keep on sending soldiers. So if the Russians could somehow peacefully protest, or let them know that we don't think this is worth it, because I think a lot of Russians might have that opinion. Like you said, if you're a man of your age, you remember the Soviet Union, but you know what? a lot of younger men left Russia because they said, I don't want to get caught up in Putin's war, right? And so as many men as he recruited, he lost because they said, no, thank you, we don't want that. And that's a good sign to me that a lot of Russians don't want this war either.
The interesting thing about the Prigozhin affair is that he marched on Moscow, yes, but not to dispose of Vladimir Putin. He said he wanted to dispose the military heads because he was not in agreement of how the military is running the war. He wasn't against the war itself, just about against how it is run, which is why if this was a coup attempt, this is the strangest coup attempt in the world, because this is like, saying, I disagree with Mr. Biden, so but I am marching on Washington with tanks in order to replace the what's the Secretary of Defense?
Lloyd Austin.
Lloyd Austin. I want to get rid of Lloyd Austin, not of Mr. Biden. I mean, that's the strangest coup attempt in the world. So the thing is, Prigozhin didn't disagree with the war.
I think that's because a lot of direct enemies of Vladimir Putin end up dead, right? And Prigozhin is now dead, isn't he? Right? A plane crash, right, over Russia. So I think he should have been a little more careful, and I think he was trying to give some indirect pushback. And I think his protest probably was like an inside military protest. He didn't like how it was being run, but Putin didn't favor it. I think it's interesting how they dress. Look how Mr. Putin wears a suit. He doesn't even want to call it a war with Ukraine, but the Ukrainian president, he wears military garb all the time. He's always got olive drab on, right? No more suits. He used to wear suits. He's trying to remind everybody, I'm a wartime president. And so they're trying to wear at war.
That's why it looks to me like a lot of show. This is showmanship, right? And because Kiev, I mean, all the Western leaders, including Mr. Biden, are able to go in and out of Kiev whenever they want, right? I mean, this is a war, but it's a war that's actually extremely highly hyper political, and Russia is not trying to annihilate the Ukrainian nation, right? Russia is not trying to do a Holocaust on the Ukrainians. This is obviously for this is politics, right? Politics by other means, the way that Clausewitz used to talk about it. And shouldn't we dial it back and try to say, like, okay, this has to be ended in negotiations, because obviously this is a war, it's a military negotiation going on, and we should dial it down.
Yeah, Donald Trump has asserted, and I don't know if he really could do it, but he's asserted, I would end that war on day one, right? He said he would end this war. And then Ron DeSantis said, okay, tell us how, right? Because I think there's a little bit of bluster in Trump. But a lot of people fear a stalemate, but I think something will happen. I don't know what, but there's too many new kinds of weapons, right? So Russia could do EMPs over parts of Ukraine to really show they're serious. They could light up nuclear weapons, not for the nuclear effect, but for the energy effect, the EMP to take out. Now, they probably don't want to do that, but they certainly could as a show of force and determined will. I don't know if there's domestic support for Putin to do that or not, because he hasn't done it yet. The U.S. and NATO have started giving, apparently, I just read today an article how the Western cruise missiles are able to penetrate the Russian air defenses, because we've considered the new Russian stuff, their air defenses, to be pretty good. But apparently, we've only just now given Ukraine some of the better cruise missiles, and they are getting through. That means they could hit whatever targets they want, right? Depending on what range weapon we give them. So I think something will happen to end this stalemate, and it may not be pretty, but
militarily. You mean militarily? You mean militarily end the stalemate?
I think so, and possibly the threat of that, which Putin's been trying to make the threat of that drive them to negotiations. But just like you understand why Ukrainians fight, I understand why they don't want to cede territory. I mean, even if the U.S. wouldn't want to give up Hawaii, even though it's, I don't know, 1% of our landmass, it's still national prestige, right? We lost a state because somebody said we want it. And I can understand why they wouldn't want to do that. I do think they should allow fair elections, right? If these states really don't want to be part of Ukraine, then they should be allowed to go the way they want to go, and then Ukraine be allowed to go the way it wants to go. But I think something will happen to break this stalemate. I've heard different projections. I don't like the projections, but I believe something will happen.
Aren't you afraid of that? Aren't you afraid that we see further escalation? Because the war can get worse. This could get worse. And if it becomes a NATO-Russia war, we might have, we might have nuclear detonations over Washington and not just over Kiev.
You know why I like the Russians, though? They're chess players. You know what I mean? The Russians, they calculate. Now, they didn't calculate very well in Ukraine, right? I think they thought they'd take it over in 3 weeks, right? So they miscalculated. But they, at least the Russians, will do calculations. They will understand that, okay, these cruise missiles are getting through our air defenses. That means their nuclear cruise missiles could get through our air defenses, right? They're going to understand that. So I don't, and the Russian, as I understand it, the Russian generals kind of have to agree with any order to fire nuclear weapons. And in the past, they've been under orders to fire, and they did not, right? There were times they didn't hear from nuclear submarines.
Luckily.
You might know better than me, but also in the 80s, they got like a false warning, like the sun triggered the infrared, right? And they were supposed to fire in the United States, but they didn't.
And it would have been the death, but not because of the staff command, because of one little guy who didn't push the button on the ground. So I mean, that's the little guy's. He saved us, not the chess players.
Well, I hope God keeps inspiring those little guys in Russia and in America, so we don't trigger that. Because you could think of a scenario where, Iran calls Israel the little Satan and the U.S. the great Satan, and it might not take much. Just imagine if Iran had a few nuclear weapons, they could put them on a sub and launch some in that Ukrainian disputed area, right? They might be able to start World War III, right? But so far, nothing like that's happened. I don't think anybody actually wants that. I think the Russians don't want it. They like threatening it, but that has only driven Sweden and Finland into NATO, and they should try to understand that you're just going to drive people away from you if you do this by force.
On the other hand, maybe let me use this as a segue to another thing. How do you view what's happening between Russia and China? Because some people portray that as an alliance. Do you see that as an alliance? Because with your argument, you could also argue, okay, well, you're just pushing Russia and China together, right?
Well, they've had wars too, right? So they only trust each other so much. It might be an alliance of convenience, right? And Russia they need weapons from North Korea and Iran, and China has been a little neutral there, saying they don't want to fully supply Russia with weapons, right? So China's being a little bit careful, and I think no one's watching what happens in Ukraine like China is, because if they have designs on Taiwan, they're going to want to watch how the cruise missiles do and how determined is the U.S. to protect an ally. And so I think it greatly matters how this war goes. That's another reason, because I know that China's watching, right? And I would rather see everybody stay out of everybody else's country, right? I don't think China needs to take Taiwan. They had Hong Kong. They could let Hong Kong be free, but they decided not to. They just should all learn that if an association is made in freedom, it's stronger and it's better, right? And that's how they should try to gain their sphere of influence.
Can I pick you up on that one? So, at the moment, the United States does still occupy a third of Syria. If we say, like, okay, everybody can choose their alliances themselves, shouldn't we also argue for a retreat of U.S. Foreign interventions? No more foreign interventions, get out of Syria, take away these military bases where they're most egregious. Again, Cuba, like the Cubans do not want Guantanamo Bay anymore operated, but the United States says, no, we have a treaty, we keep our people there. Either they stay there because we have weapons, so they stay there. So even though the Cubans say, like, please get out, the United States doesn't get out. Should that not apply as well?
Syria, if you go back a few years, Syria is kind of a good news story, because Barack Obama wanted to expand the war in Syria. He wanted to send more U.S. forces and say we need this to beat up. He called it the Levant. President Trump called it ISIS and said, but you know what? The American people pushed back and said, no. We've been at this war with Afghanistan for so long. We don't want to intrude in Syria. They don't understand the problem, the Americans in general. And they pushed back on Obama and said, no, we don't want this. And I thought that was great, because the Americans can be tricked into war, right? Because we go rah-rah and we want to root for the little guy. And so I think we have been led into wars unrighteously. But we did dodge an escalation in Syria. And so, but the problem is, here's the tricky part. If you leave a vacuum, who's going to fill it? Right. So we would have to make a deal that everybody leaves Syria. But then if somebody else, is Iran going to infiltrate, or is Russia going to come back? Because Russia's been in there a long time.
But Syria is a bit different because we do have an internationally recognized Syrian government, the Assad government, that controls about a third to a half of Syria, and then we have the Turks who have like a part, and the United States, which is in a part, and that government claims, said like, look, this is officially my land. I mean, this is Syrian land, so this should be governed by Syria. And Mr. Assad just was in China, so the Chinese recognize. I mean, everybody recognizes, basically, not everybody, that's not true, but a very good part of the world population, about 100. I would say 2/3, if not 3/4, recognize the Syrian government. So shouldn't it? I mean, they would immediately be able to take over these plots. These plots are the ones with the oil, and we know, thanks to Donald Trump, who said, "Don't worry, we've got the oil. We keep the oil. The oil is safe." He said that in 2017. Why is it that the United States has this special position where it can occupy places around the world?
I think part of it is we have some trust, and we're partners with Israel, right? We're an ally with Israel, and I think part of it is we worry that is Syria going to be a proxy state for Iran, who hates Israel? Are they going to allow attacks to be launched or forces to be massed? And I think we've always got our eye on that around Israel. We don't bother Jordan, right? They're not trying to make war on Israel. Same with Egypt. Egypt has been peaceful with Israel for decades now. Even the Saudi Arabians have been more accepting of Israel. They've allowed some overflight rights, and they've basically given the nod that if Israel wanted to go bomb Iran to stop their nuclear programs, Saudi Arabia would probably look the other way, right? So I think we have built some trust there, and it is a problem because Biden has done a terrible job with Saudi Arabia. They used to be a great U.S. ally, and now the Chinese and Russians are making gains there. That is the problem, why it's hard to pull out of places that we've got an interest in. Same with Turkey. I mean, I recognize that they're very friendly with Russia, but they're technically a member of NATO. But we have to watch it because we have a term, frenemy. You've probably heard that term, right? Where they're a little bit of both, right? And we don't really want frenemies, but these are complex. We're going from all these countries, right? But people want freedom, and I really think that's what America should stand for.
But what about the freedom of the Palestinians? Because in the equation, Palestine versus Israel, the Palestinians are the little guy, right? What about the freedom of the Palestinians?
Well, we made, after World War II, right, when the world was feeling a little bit mushy for the Jews that had been given a bad deal in Germany, right? We said, and it was actually a biblical prediction, that in one day Israel would become a nation again, and they did, and that's very rare. Usually a nation fights and struggles, but Israel became a nation in one day. There were some immediate wars, but the Palestinians, that's why Jordan was created. People forget that, but Jordan was created to be an area for those that had been in this new territory of Israel, right, that had been reborn as a nation. Jordan was where any Arabs that didn't want to live under Israeli rule, they were welcome to go to Jordan. And it was the original two-state solution, was Jordan.
Yeah, but now we're talking ethnic cleansing. If the idea is that the Palestinians have to give up their lands and have all to move to Jordan, that's the definition of ethnic cleansing.
Well, that was a choice, right? So if they choose to stay in Israel, then they were signing up to be under Israeli rule. I think that's the entire reason Jordan was set off as that. See, I'm more of an ally of Israel too, and I see that everybody wants to keep encroaching on Israel, and there's only so much there to encroach, right? And I think if they're peaceful, then they're treated reasonably as citizens. They've got members of the Knesset that are Palestinian, right? So they have some representation.
Yeah, but the whole problem that Israel has is there is these Palestinian territories that are not part of the Israeli state, right? And that were hoped that would one day become part of the Palestinian state. If they are a Palestinian state, then you've got the Israelis in one and the Palestinians in the other, but that's nothing that Israel agrees to. But if Israel actually makes all of these territories Israel, and gives everybody equal rights, then you suddenly have a state where 55% or 60% of the state are not Jews, where the majority is Palestinians, and that's something that the Israeli government also doesn't want. It wants the land, but it doesn't want the people. So what we are saying is actually what you're saying, that the Israeli the strategy is to somehow get rid of the people but keep the land, and that is a crime against humanity under the UN Charter, right? So how it's just
Well, okay,
because of the freedom, the freedom and the liberty aspect, the liberty and the freedom of the Palestinians to live in their lands. Why does the US not support that? Or why not the US, but you're not speaking for the US?
Israel's a little different because right now we've been talking geopolitics. I'm a guy with an opinion, you're a guy with an opinion, and we have different facts we look at and how we see it. But okay, so Israel's different. Why? Because, and as an American, a lot of us are Bible believing Christians. I am too. That this land was given to them by God, right? And they were told, don't divide the land. That's what God told them. I'm going to give you this land, don't divide. It was much bigger. Original Israel was much bigger. And yet the advice seems good because every time they try to trade land for peace, they don't get peace, right? They give up land. They gave up that whole, what's that desert with Egypt called? That whole huge area they gave back to Egypt. They are doing better with Egypt, but they've given up land for peace before, but then there's just new demands for more land, right? And I see that if the Palestinians would not attack Israel, if they would not build tunnels under the walls, if they would not attack schools, if they would not do bombings, I think Israel would treat them okay, right? I mean, we have all these different nationalities in America, and I don't think any of them are really persecuted, right? I mean, I think we do a good job with that. People can come here and assimilate and they have the same rights as a citizen as someone born here. And I think Israel would be that way if they weren't under attack, because basically if you harbor terrorists, that's a problem. And that's what I see the Palestinian problem, that they want to make claims, but then they're not peaceful citizens. And then you're going to be treated like terrorists if you act like terrorists.
But you argued for the Ukraine's right to defend its territory. Now the Palestinians, they have territory that was, I mean, even UN recognized territory, and Israel just doesn't abide by that. Just keeps building its settlements, and then when Palestinians fight against it, as you said with the Ukrainians, you understand why the Ukrainians fight for the land, but the Palestinians are supposed to not fight for the land and accept to be just non-voting parts of a state that suppresses them.
Whose land was it? If you go back far enough, it was the land of Israel, right? It was originally Israeli land.
2,000 years ago.
2,000 years ago. And see, this is where I think the Bible comes in. It makes Israel different than every other country on the earth, because God said, I'm going to disperse you, and then I'm going to call you back. And that's exactly what's happened. And so and he said, there's promises that they would get Jerusalem back, and they have got Jerusalem back, right? So Israel's a very special case. And while the Israelis they're commanded, even in the Old Testament that the Jews believe in, to treat the foreigner and the stranger kindly, right? They should. Now, if they attack you, you can defend yourself. So they may need a lesson. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure China will like that kind of argument, because the Chinese keep arguing Taiwan is theirs because it has been historically theirs. So if historical precedence is a reason to legitimize power, then
but God didn't give Taiwan to the Taiwanese in the Bible and say, this is your land, don't subdivide it, I'll defend you, fight for it. But he did tell the Jews that, right? And they're back in Israel now. And it's a whole separate case, right? It's just a different can of worms. And yet I will say this, anyone that has tried to divide Israel, and this could be why Donald Trump is no longer president. I'll just put on my religious point of view for a minute. It says that anyone that tries to divide Israel will be divided, right? And so there's a curse. It says, if you bless Israel, I will bless you. If you curse them, I will curse you. So all these American politicians that say, let's divide up Israel some more. Bad idea. Don't do that. Let them try to live in peace with their neighbors as best they can. And that would be my advice to Palestinians, is quit electing people that want to make war with Israel and live as peaceful citizens, and you'll be treated as peaceful citizens.
And give up Palestine, like no more Palestine. The idea of a Palestinian state should be given up. Is that the point?
Let's just say they were kind of, and what was a Palestinian? Most Palestinians are really Egyptians, right? They had a country, they had Egypt, right? So it's kind of a made up term. The Romans called even the Jews that lived there Palestinians, right? It was all Palestine to them, but it's really Israel. And so maybe they were squatters, right? But now the owner's back in the house, and so it's their land. Like I say, it's a special case. I view Israel different than others, right? So you're getting, I guess, that point of view too, and separate from others. But I believe American politicians should be careful with Israel, that we should be an ally and a friend to them. And yet a friend can also say, hey, we think you're doing wrong. Don't persecute these people unnecessarily. Treat them as proper citizens. If they're being terrorists, then yes, you could go after them, but treat them as you'd want to be treated. So I think that's how we should deal with Israel, is you guys need to be a proper nation state, right? And treat everybody under your borders properly.
All right, Bob, I think we can agree that we would like people to live peacefully and prosperously in the world. We don't see things similarly, but it has been an hour, so I would like to thank you very much for taking the time of talking today.
Thank you. You're very civilized, Pascal. I appreciate talking with you.
See you later.